When the silence bloomed again, a story of love, loss, and the quiet bravery of starting over in the stillness of winter. The wind carried the scent of fading chrysanthemums, their petals curling inward as if retreating from the inevitable approach of winter. In a quiet town nestled between the Han River and a spine of distant hills, the days had grown shorter, shadows stretching longer with each sunset. Time moved gently here, like water slipping past stones. And in the middle of it all stood a woman with tired eyes and a coat too thin for the cold. Her name was Sua. There had been a time when Sua had dreamed of a life in motion, one filled with city lights, gallery openings, and the hum of distant applause. She had painted for years, chasing the feeling of color on canvas like it was air itself. But dreams had edges, and reality wore them down until they dulled into silence. Now she moved through life like a ghost of herself, existing rather than living, her heart tucked behind too many closed doors. Each morning, she rose before the sun and walked to the small school where she taught art to children whose eyes still burned with wonder. She taught them how to hold a brush, how to see beyond outlines, and how to find stories in color. And when the bell rang and the halls emptied, she would sit alone in the classroom, watching dust dance in the light. She rarely painted anymore. Her apartment was filled with canvases unfinished, untouched, each a testament to something she could no longer find the strength to complete. They leaned against the walls like abandoned memories, pieces of a voice once loud and full that had since learned the quietness of restraint. There had been love, once. It had come unexpectedly, like all great stories do. It had been tender at first, slow, uncertain, but unmistakably real. He had been the kind of man who spoke more in silence than words, who noticed the details most people missed. His presence had steadied her, like hands pressed gently to her back in a world that kept pulling away. Their love had bloomed in that delicate space between yearning and fear. They met in late spring, when everything in Seoul was in bloom and the world felt drenched in possibility. Together they walked the city streets, visited antique bookstores, and shared coffee in quiet cafes where time seemed to hold its breath. But love, no matter how genuine, could not shield them from the weight of their separate lives. He belonged to a world of structure suits, obligations, a family that whispered legacy like a curse. His days were scheduled, his future mapped before he ever met her, and she was chaos to him. Beautiful, aching chaos. The artist who lived by the whim of emotion, who saw beauty in things falling apart. She tried to fit into his world for a time, tried to smile at the right moments and silence the dissonance inside her. But love cannot survive when suffocated. There was no argument, no final goodbye, just a gradual erosion, like cliffs crumbling under the pressure of too many waves. One day he stopped reaching for her hand. One day, she stopped waiting for him to. And when he left quietly, without fanfare, he took with him the last light she had believed in. Seasons passed. Her heart did not mend, only settled, like sediment at the bottom of still water. And yet, life continued in its quiet cruelty. Autumn had arrived again, and with it the rustle of dry leaves scraping across concrete, the way memories do across old wounds. Soa moved through her routines with mechanical grace, grocery shopping on Sundays, laundry on Wednesdays, and calling her mother once every 2 weeks. But even in the stillness, she felt something shifting. Not in the world, but within herself. A subtle restlessness. A stirring beneath the quiet. One afternoon, as golden light poured through the studio windows, Sua stood before a blank canvas for the first time in months. Her fingers hovered above her old brushes, hesitant, reverent. The silence around her was complete, as though the air itself was waiting. She didn't know why she picked up the brush. Perhaps because the silence had grown too loud. Perhaps because something inside her had begun to ache again, not with pain, but with the memory of joy. She painted slowly, without intent. There was no plan, no sketch, just color, layered and layered until something emerged. It wasn't beautiful, not in the conventional sense, but it was raw, real. It was hers. Day by day, she returned to the canvas. Her hands remembered what her heart had tried to forget. She painted with grief, with love, with all the pieces of herself she had buried. She painted the ache of a held breath, the silence of waiting, and the bittersweet warmth of a memory that refused to fade. And with each stroke, she began to feel alive again, not whole, but present. The town noticed. The quiet Sua, who had lived in shadows, now displayed her work in the school's small gallery. Children walked past her paintings, pointing and marveling. Parents asked questions. A neighbor brought her flowers. Life, once still, now stirred gently around her, like wind brushing through tall grass. She did not think of him every day, but when she did, it was softer now. Not the sharp ache of loss, but the tender recognition of something once beautiful. There were no what-ifs left in her heart, only gratitude for having felt something so deep, even if it was no longer hers. Winter arrived quietly, snow brushing rooftops like powdered sugar. Sua stood one morning on her balcony, cradling a warm mug in her hands. The sky was pale and overcast, and the street below was silent under a thick blanket of white. For the first time in years, she did not feel cold. The cold came sooner than expected. Snow clung to rooftops and telephone wires, and the town braced against a quiet winter that seemed heavier than the ones before. Soa found herself painting more frequently, not for recognition or revival, but because it was the only way she knew to remain anchored. Her colors turned subdued, lines sharper, the emotion behind her brush no longer seeking resolution but release. The exhibition had passed. She had returned from Seoul to the silence of her apartment, the noise and attention fading like the echo of a storm. People had admired her work. Some offered opportunities. One piece had been sold to a collector she would never meet. And yet, in the weeks that followed, she felt no triumph, only a deepening quiet, a kind of numbness that settled into her chest like frost. The memory of seeing him again remained with her not in pain, but in a weight that she could not put down. That moment in the gallery had been brief, but it opened a door she had long sealed shut. She didn't regret it. But afterwards, sleep came harder, and her hands trembled more often. In early January, a letter arrived. It bore his name, written carefully, the ink slightly smudged as though he had hesitated before finishing. The message inside was short, a few lines, words that read more like confessions than explanations. He had been ill, he wrote, quietly, for some time. He hadn't told her before because he hadn't wanted pity, hadn't wanted to burden what they once had. But something about seeing her again had brought him peace. He thanked her for that, and he said goodbye. Soa read the letter under the pale light of her kitchen and did not cry. Not immediately. She sat there for a long time, letting the snow fall thick beyond the window, letting the silence hold her. The following days were marked by a hollow rhythm. She went to work, she spoke to her students, and she even smiled. But something had shifted. There was a tightness in her chest. Not panic, not fear, just a slow, relentless ache. At night, she lay awake listening to the hum of the radiator and the wind scratching against the windows, imagining what he might be seeing in his final days, wondering if he thought of her. She did not reply to the letter. There was nothing left to say. When the call came a week later, she had already sensed it. His sister's voice was gentle, grief softened. He had passed quietly, she said, in his sleep. There would be a private service, no fanfare. That was what he had wanted. Soa did not attend. Instead, she walked to the old bridge the morning of the funeral, wrapped in a scarf he once gave her, the air sharp against her skin. The river below had begun to thaw, patches of dark water visible beneath the ice. She stood there for hours, letting the cold seep in, anchoring herself to the memory of what had been. Back in her apartment, she began a painting. It was larger than her usual canvas, wide enough to span half the studio wall. She worked on it slowly, days stretching into weeks. The colors were muted, winter-heavy. The image that emerged was not of him, nor of them, but of a moment suspended, a lone figure standing beneath bare trees, snow falling gently around them, their back turned to the viewer. Alone, but not lost. Still. She called it the last season. It never hung in a gallery. She never spoke about it. But it remained in her home, the only painting she refused to part with. The rest of the year passed in quiet ripples. Spring came late, reluctantly. Her students graduated. A child gifted her a painting of a tree with hearts in its branches. Her mother visited more often. The world, unbothered by personal grief, continued. Soa aged, gracefully, subtly. The streaks of silver in her hair became more visible. Her walks grew slower, but she never stopped painting. Her works changed less raw, more reflective. Pieces of a woman who had learned that healing did not mean forgetting. Sometimes, on particularly cold nights, she would reread the letter, not for comfort, but for remembrance. A tether to a love that had shaped her, quiet and incomplete. Years later, when a young curator visited her studio for a retrospective, he asked about the painting on the far wall. The one untouched by dust, lit by its own window. She simply said it was a season she once lived through, and left it at that. In the stillness between autumn and winter, something inside her had ended. But something else, a quiet, unspoken resilience had begun, and it carried her forward, even as the snow continued to fall.